you. And if we need the mic, I will pass it along to our panelists as we talk about this. But tonight we do have some presentations, but really we want this to be an opportunity to be able to answer folks' questions and have some good dialogue about what is going on nationally, what are the implications of what's going on nationally for folks here in Georgia, especially as we are starting to look at tax time here in Georgia, and then kind of where do we go from here? So what are some of the next steps with everything? So we are also streaming this live on the web stream, so when we do get to doing questions and answers, hopefully everybody can wait till the end for your questions. If there is something that is just absolutely positively burning in you and you just cannot wait, I think that all of our panelists will be flexible enough to try to answer your questions there, but I think it's going to go just much more smoothly if we can wait till the end for questions and answers, and that also will give us an opportunity for folks who are online to be able to fully participate. Em, can you tell us how many folks are online right now? Do you know?
We have about 40 people online right now.
Cool. So with that, yeah, the 30, 40 that are here and the 40 folks that are online, like I say, some more folks may be joining us in a little bit. So want to thank you all for being here. The way we will do the program tonight is we will have Tara Borelli from Lambda Legal that will kind of walk us through the legal environment right now. And then Lynn Pasqualetti with HLM Financial Services is going to talk about some of the tax implications, some of the things that you need to be on the lookout for as you are figuring out your own tax status. And then I will speak at the end kind of on our next steps. And like I said, then we want to make sure that we have plenty of time, at least half an hour, 45 minutes for questions and answers and conversation. So with that, Tara, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Well, thank you all so much. Oh, goodness. That's an auspicious start. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here, to be joined by such terrific experts, and to be here with Georgia Equality, and also to join Lynn. It's really an honor for me. I'm an attorney with Lambda Legal. I do sometimes struggle with volume, so if you have trouble hearing me, just do this, and I will adjust. And what I'm going to do tonight is just start by talking a little bit about scope. My goal here is to give some broad brush overview and strokes about, thank you, some broad brush overview about what the status of the movement is in the courts right now. And I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about all the work that we need to happen to support the work happening in the courts, because nothing can happen in just one track. We can't be working in silos. We've got to be working together. And all of the efforts that we make, both inside and outside the courts, are mutually supporting, so we need them all happening in lockstep. But I'm going to focus on that, and the other thing that I'm going to do is actually ask people, many of you are going to be facing very specific situations, circumstances that are personal to you, that give rise to a series of legal questions. What I'm going to ask for those kinds of questions, if they aren't about kind of things that are broadly applicable to the community, is to hold those questions and come see me at the end. And I believe Lynn would suggest the same on the subject of taxes, which is what she's going to address too. And there are a few reasons for that, including, perhaps most importantly, that sometimes some of your facts may actually be sensitive and you may not even know it, but the best way to preserve confidentiality is to talk one-on-one with a lawyer. If you say something publicly, then confidentiality is waived, and so we want to try to be protective of people. So come see me afterwards. Lambda Legal also maintains a legal help desk, so if it's not feasible to come talk to me, look up our Atlanta office online. You can call our help desk there, and we are very, very glad to take your calls and answer questions to the greatest extent we can, or to help find somebody who can. So let me start with, I have sort of a dual track message here. One is, I want to talk about all the reasons that we have to be incredibly hopeful and excited about everything happening right now. I think many of us could not possibly have dreamed that we would be where we are right now at the beginning of 2014. On the other hand, I want to come back to a message at the end that has to do with the fact that that doesn't mean we can stop being strategic, and it also doesn't mean that we can rest on our laurels. If anything, now is the moment to redouble our efforts and work twice as hard. So on the hopeful front, let me talk a little bit about kind of where things stand in terms of the picture of equality across the country. So incredibly enough, we have 17 states where same-sex couples can get married right now. On Monday, for a period of time, it was 18. We've taken a temporary step back in Utah, but I think it's just going to be a matter of time. In the interim, 17 other states, plus the District of Columbia, are where same-sex couples can get married. 3 additional states offer very broad protections in the form of civil unions or broad domestic partnerships. So those are 3 additional states where people have everything but the name marriage, although that is significant and ultimately what we're fighting for. That puts 41% of the population of the United States in a state with either marriage equality or broad protections through civil unions or domestic partnership, and that is just staggering. To put that in very recent historical perspective, it's the beginning of 2014. Many of you may remember back to 2003. That was the year that Lambda Legal had a case that went to the Supreme Court called Lawrence versus Texas. And this was a case that eliminated all of the remaining sodomy laws. These were the criminal laws that were on the books at that time that punished our intimate relationships. In 2003, when the Supreme Court ruled and struck down those remaining laws, there were 14 of those sodomy laws on the books that made us criminals for our intimate relationships. And here we are just a little over a decade later, and we're at 17 states where we can marry. That is extraordinary progress by any measure, and that's one of the reasons that we do feel so hopeful and so excited about what the future holds. That said, it's not a done deal yet. We are still having setbacks right through the present day. It looks like there's been a lot of success and great victories in the courts, but I do want to remind people, and this sort of goes to the strategic note I sounded a little earlier, we have not persuaded everybody. In fact, just in 2012, there were 2 marriage cases pending, one in a trial court in Las Vegas in a Lambda Legal marriage equality case and another case in Hawaii. Those are not wildly conservative places by any stretch of the imagination, but we got 2 incredibly disappointing rulings. Out of those trial courts, our judge in Nevada, regretfully enough, said that if same-sex couples were allowed to marry in the state of Nevada, we might see a meaningful percentage of heterosexuals who would no longer want to be associated with the institution, and that was good enough for him to continue locking the gates of marriage towards our community. And in Hawaii, we had another equally disappointing opinion. Now obviously that state has since legislatively moved towards marriage, which is fabulous, but in just 2012, a federal court in Hawaii ruled that marriage could continue to be exclusive of same-sex couples because of these whispers we always hear from the other side about parenting and children. And this is a primary argument they make in every single one of these cases, and that judge bought it, even though the research, the science, the literature, and the consensus of every major medical, mental health, behavioral health organization is that of course we make equally fine parents to our children. So those are some cautionary notes. I feel like it looks a little bit like you just file a case and you just win automatically and you have marriage right away and everything's great. And unfortunately, we are going to have to deal with some steps backward along the way. That's okay, that's part of any movement, but we are working as hard as we can to avoid those steps backward because more wins is better than losses in terms of the way forward. So I've been asked to talk just a little bit about the recent timeline of events, including what happened in the Supreme Court. I'm going to be very brief about this because I know there was a prior town hall that focused entirely on what those decisions looked like, but this does help frame up where we are now and what's coming next. So as many of you know, there were, of course, 2 cases that were decided by the Supreme Court in its last term. One was Windsor. That case dealt with the so-called Federal Defense of Marriage Act, and that was a federal law that had 2 parts. The Supreme Court dealt with only one of them, Section 3, and Section 3 had to deal with whether the federal government has to recognize the valid marriages that same-sex couples have entered into in the states that allow it. And obviously we had a lovely, beautiful decision from Justice Kennedy, who recognized that this wasn't just about the couples, this was also about their children who are humiliated when society marks them as second-class citizens. And we have a lovely opinion saying that part of DOMA is unconstitutional. Since then, we've been paying very close attention to the federal government's efforts to implement that, as a number of questions have come up about what about various kinds of benefits, what about couples who marry in one state, they move to another state, or they live in another state where their marriage isn't recognized. And there's one key takeaway from the federal implementation efforts, and that is marriage matters. In all of the guidance that's been issued, in virtually all of it, what the federal government has said is we're going to strive to recognize marriages, even if you don't live in a place that recognized your marriage, as long as it was valid where it was entered. We're going to look to that place of celebration. If that place of celebration gave you a valid marriage, we, the federal government, will honor it too. There are a few exceptions to that. There are a couple of laws on the books. There's one in the area of veterans benefits, one in the area of Social Security, where the government is still trying to figure out how to work with those statutes which defer to the state where you live. But we think there's great reason to think that we'll see progress on those fronts as well. And in the meantime, the federal government is urging everybody, just apply for Social Security benefits. No matter where you live, just apply, preserve your claim. In all of that guidance, however, there's been almost a uniform message, which is marriage only. The federal government will recognize marriages. We will not recognize domestic partnerships. We will not recognize civil unions. There are just a few tiny exceptions to that, but for the most part, that's the clear trend. And in fact, that principle was the basis on which we just recently won our marriage case in New Jersey, where the trial court looked at that fact and said, New Jersey, you're saying that what you're giving couples through civil unions is good enough. But what we have is an equal protection clause, not a good enough protection clause. And it's not nearly good enough when we look to the entire spectrum of federal benefits that you're now blocking. You, New Jersey, by not allowing these couples to be married, you're standing in the way of couples getting those benefits, particularly for those couples who live in the state and have not married elsewhere. And that cannot stand. And so that's a really significant thing. We're using that, we're pointing that out in all of our cases to the courts, and the courts are taking that very seriously. But what it tells us is there can be no half measure, there can be no halfway. We will only have equality when we really have full equality. We have access to marriage for all, and that is, of course, what we're all working so hard towards. Of course, there was also another case, Hollingsworth, which was the challenge to California's Proposition 8. There were a number of options on the menu for the court in that case. The Supreme Court could have adopted a narrow California marriage-only rule. Supreme Court could have adopted a rule that said every state that has broad domestic partnerships like California, that was about 7 states at the time, marriage in those places, or the court could have done a nationwide marriage for everybody ruling, and of course the court took none of them. They didn't order anything on the menu because it decided that the only defendants that had actually appealed to it, which were the proposition proponents, just did not have a concrete stake in the outcome of the case, because at the end of the day, people might have private opinions about whether we should marry, but unless you're a defendant official that we've sued, your private opinion cannot stand in the way of our ability to make our arguments for equality, and that's certainly not good enough to force a case up to the Supreme Court. So because there was nobody left in the case who would defend the law, who actually had a concrete stake in it, the court said what stands now is that beautiful trial court decision from that federal trial court in Northern California, and that's the law of the land. So we didn't get many tea leaves to read. What we have in terms of tea leaves are what Justice Kennedy said in Windsor, and that's partly what has had us all so excited. But obviously, Windsor was only about DOMA, and there's a ways to go between striking down DOMA and getting marriage equality everywhere in the country. I want to talk just briefly about the very last word we heard from the Supreme Court, and that was the recent commotion in Utah. And I want to explain why actually I think we shouldn't read too much into what the court just did. So as many of you know, less than a month ago, on December 20th, trial court in Utah issued a beautiful decision saying same-sex couples must be allowed to marry. And that was not stayed by the trial court judge. Now that makes sense. He had made his decision. He felt the couples should be able to marry, and he knew that he was correct on the law. So why would we hold up couples being able to exercise the rights that they're entitled to? Most judges have actually stayed their opinions in these cases, but he certainly had perfectly good ground on which to not do it. Then a request to stay the decision went to the 10th Circuit. The 10th Circuit turned down that request. That was only 2 judges on the 10th Circuit, but nonetheless, that allowed the marriages to continue. That was unusual, I have to say. In the vast majority of marriage cases where there's been a victory at the trial court and there's been an appeal, marriages have not happened in the middle of that process. And that's usually because the courts like things to be orderly and deliberative and maybe sometimes a bit too slow for our taste, but they do like order, and that's why generally couples have had to wait until the very end of the marriage case to get married. So when the Supreme Court did that and imposed that order by staying the decision of the trial court and temporarily suspending the marriages, it wasn't a big surprise, and I also think it doesn't tell us anything substantive about what the court will ultimately do. So we don't take any negative inference from that. In fact, that was what many people expected the Supreme Court to do, and it just means that the case will proceed in the orderly way that these often have. Okay, so with all this excitement in the courts are just packed right now with marriage cases. Here are the numbers. Unless something has been filed since I left my office, which is perfectly plausible, but as of the moment I left my office, there were 43 marriage equality lawsuits pending in states across the country. That includes 27 cases in federal courts, 16 cases in state courts, and because some of those cases overlap, we are talking about cases challenging the laws in a total of 23 states. And that is just an incredible amount of activity. I do want to say that the South is very, very well represented in this picture of the fight for marriage equality. That's something that particularly pleases us. We have felt from the beginning that marriage equality could not just be a coastal phenomenon, and that is exactly why when there was a lot of activity happening in California and Washington and in New York, we looked to the middle of the country, and we started in the 2000s in Iowa. And we had done our research, and we knew that there were very good reasons to put our faith in the pragmatism and the common sense of Iowans, and that research and that leap of faith turned out to be exactly right. And we ended up getting in 2009 a beautiful decision from the Iowa Supreme Court that was unanimous. And that was incredibly important to us because we just cannot leave any part of the country behind. That's exactly why more recently we have filed 2 cases in the South, one in West Virginia and one in Virginia with our sister organization, the ACLU. There are cases pending in North Carolina, South Carolina, Louisiana, Mississippi. The list goes on. So that means that in fact there's quite a bit of activity here in the South, which is exciting. The overall picture is certainly one of momentum, notwithstanding a couple of the setbacks that I mentioned. In just the last month alone, there have been 4 different federal decisions requiring marriage or recognition of valid marriages in certain circumstances. And just that little slice includes Utah, of course. Many of you probably heard about a decision out of Ohio that had to do with the limited circumstance of married couples where one of them wanted to have a spouse that they had lost listed on a death certificate, and the court said, yes, you're entitled to that. And in Illinois, even though marriage equality, many of you might be thinking, wait, Illinois, isn't Illinois done? Didn't we win that fight in the legislature? We did, but the effective date is a ways out, and we started hearing from couples where one partner was terminally ill, and they were not going to be able to make it until the date of the law. And so we filed 2 successive federal lawsuits to set up a mechanism so that couples where one has a terminal illness and they won't be able to survive until marriage equality becomes the law now have access to get married, and those couples are actually married in Illinois at this moment. So that's all very, very exciting. Okay, now let me come to the wet blanket portion of our programming. One practical question that comes up for a lot of couples is, should we go get married somewhere to be able to take advantage of all of these federal rights and responsibilities? Obviously, that's a deeply personal decision. And so all I'm going to do is point out a couple of the features of the law right now that may be significant to any given couple. There are some reasons that certain couples may want to be cautious about making that choice. One is if either partner happens to be receiving public assistance. For example, if you're receiving public assistance and you're not married and the federal government is only looking at your income, if you get married, the federal government will likely start looking at the income of your household, and that may mean that a partner would lose eligibility. Also, for some couples who are considering international adoptions, there are certain countries that refuse to adopt to same-sex couples, and so having a public statement that you're a couple, such as getting married, may have an effect on your ability to go through that adoption process. If that's your boat, then you want to talk to somebody who's a family law attorney who can give you advice about that. Also, the other thing that I want to flag, and again, we're in the wet blanket portion, nobody wants to think about getting out of a marriage when they're getting into it. But the inevitable reality is that we know that approximately 50% of different sex couples' marriages end in divorce. And we're certainly not immune to that, and we're seeing a number of cases in the courts right now that actually show what what a difficult and tough problem this can be for couples, including there's at least one case I think right now in the Texas Supreme Court involving a couple that needs to get a divorce and they're stuck. And the reason for that is in most states, if not all, when you're getting a divorce, the court needs to have jurisdiction over you. And the way that happens is by having residency in that state. You need to be a resident of that state for a certain period of time. For example, a number of states have a 6-month residency period. So if a couple lives somewhere in the South, flies to another state and gets married, goes back to their home in the South, and ultimately the relationship breaks up, it's going to be very difficult for one of them to pick up their life, go to the state where they got married, set up shop for 6 months so that the court can acquire jurisdiction. This is one example of how people can get stuck. There are some states that are taking steps to try to address that problem because it is a real problem. And so something that you want to do if you're thinking about getting married is talk to a family law attorney. Family law attorneys, many of them are tracking these developments carefully, and they have a sense of whether there are certain states that it might be a little bit easier to get out of the marriage, and so that might be a place that a couple wants to think about going. Again, I know it's not romantic, but practical is good too. The last thing that I want to leave you with is, so lots of excitement about the courts. That's a wonderful thing. The lawyers are just loving this. This is like our best geeking out moment right now because it's not that often that people are that excited about what we're doing. But I will say, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, I believe that the success that we've been having in the courts comes because of all of the supportive work that people are doing in an individual level, at an organizational level, through organizations like Georgia Equality, and that is because people are coming out, do it where it's safe, but people are coming out, people are getting to know us, to respect us, to see our shared and common humanity, and all of that work, all of the work in the legislature, all of the educational work, the work to support our youth in schools, all of that work I think combines to create a better environment where courts can feel assured that their decisions are going to be respected when they do the right thing on the law. And it also helps make sure that people are ready to step up and respect those decisions and follow the law. And I'm particularly focused on that because the legal help desk that we run, we hear from thousands of people every year, even in places with really good laws on the books, and places with the luxury of anti-discrimination laws that have been around forever, and people are still getting discriminated against on the job. They're still having trouble in many areas of their life, and that's why all of this has to be done with the idea that we've got to educate people about what the law is, educate people about our right to be treated equally, and get everybody invested in doing that so that we have fewer people having problems no matter what the law is on the books. So with that, I'll pause, and I look forward to questions at the end, and I will turn it over to Lynn.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't think I need the mic, I'm not sure, but I've got a pretty loud voice. The biggest issue that I find, and I heed your warning for everybody out here, myself included, is don't rush into getting married just because we can. And there's a lot to think about. With that comes a lot of responsibility, but it also comes the tax responsibility and what happens with your income taxes. And we are having a heyday in the CPA, EA, tax attorney community because we haven't had anything new and exciting to look at for a long time. And so this is a big deal, okay? As soon as the Supreme Court decision came down in the Windsor case, I must have gotten 45 phone calls from other CPAs around the city and around the state. Isn't this exciting? It's like, well, yeah, but we don't know what it means yet. Okay, so we didn't know whether we were going to follow the federal law, what we were going to have to do, whether they're going to recognize that, fortunately, if you're married in your place of celebration for a federal tax purpose, you're going to file a joint income tax return, period. Okay? Now, that means you can file a married filing joint or a married filing separate. Doesn't mean you can file single or head of household. If you are married, even in a prior year, not just the current year, but a prior year, you're going to file a joint return or make a decision to file a separate return. Now, why would you file a separate return when you work so hard to be able to get married? Good question. Basically, if you don't want to take the responsibility for your partner or your spouse on that tax return, you would not want to file a joint tax return with that individual. Not because you don't love them, not because you don't want to report together, but maybe they're in a business by themselves and you know nothing about the business. When you sign a joint tax return, at the bottom of the return, if you read in real small print, it says you're jointly and severally liable. That means whatever your partner says or does on that return, whether you take responsibility for it or not, you have 100% responsibility for both parties, and so does your spouse. That might kind of sway things a little bit. Well, IRS has put some provisions in place that say, if you file a separate tax return, we're going to penalize you. You need to be married, you need to enjoy the marriage benefits, and you need to file a joint tax return. And if you choose not to, that's okay, but we're going to take a lot of the deductions away. So you really have to weigh, does it make sense to be married filing joint or married filing separate? That's your first step on the federal level. If you live separately, and you live separately for a full year, then you could file single, but why would you do that if you've just gotten married? Okay, so there are a lot of other tax provisions. I'm just going to kind of do an overview of the total, okay? But basically, you would probably be filing a joint tax return. With this transition, saying that we can file a joint tax return because of place of celebration, we also have the opportunity to go back and amend if it makes sense. If you got married in 2010, or married in 2010, 11, or 12, you can go back and amend those tax returns and get back a refund. You probably wouldn't want to amend if you're going to owe them money, unless you just want to support the government, okay? But if you're going to get a refund by filing a joint tax return, then you can go back and amend your tax return for 2010, 11, and 12. And why the 3 years? Those are the 3 open years for amending a return. You have 3 years after the due date of the return to go back and claim a refund, okay? So that's why that's the cutoff. So 2010 was due in 11, 12, 13, 14. So guess what? April 15th of 2014, if you don't amend that 2010 return, you can no longer do that after April 15th, 2014. So think about that when you're going back to look at the process. It doesn't always make sense to amend because you might have a high-income taxpayer and a low-income taxpayer. In that case, chances are you're going to get a refund when you file a joint return. If you have 2 high-income taxpayers, it's probably going to hurt you, and you're going to end up owing money. So that's another consideration when you decide, am I going to get married or not? Do I want to pay more tax to have the benefits of marriage? Does that make sense? If you make $150,000 a piece, $150,000 a year a piece, chances are it's going to cost you somewhere between, and this is just a rough number, but between $10,000 and about $15,000 more to file that joint tax return. That's a big consideration to think about. Is it really worth it? So that's tax planning, and you will have to make that decision based on your personal beliefs, what you want to think is important, and whether you want to support the federal government in a little bit heavier manner, okay? So that's our federal level. On the state level, what happens? If you file in the state, if you live in the state of Georgia, which I'm assuming almost everybody in this room lives in the state of Georgia, Georgia does not recognize same-sex marriage because the way the code is it's between a man and a woman, period. So we don't have the benefit of same-sex marriage in the state of Georgia. So you file a joint federal tax return, and now you're getting ready to do your Georgia tax return. If you remember, your Georgia tax return starts with federal adjusted gross income. What is that for a married couple? Well, we only have one return. So right now, IRS says you're going to have to recast your financials or your tax return, and you're basically going to end up having a married filing joint federal return and 2 federal returns that are recast as single or head of household possibly on the state of Georgia, and then you're going to start from there. So you're going to end up really with 2 federal returns for the state of Georgia to get your adjusted gross income. You're going to have your Georgia returns, which is going to be 2, and you're going to have your married filing joint returns. So instead of having 4 returns, we now have 5. We don't file the married, yeah. The accountants are happy because it's more money, okay? We've been trying to figure out how to bill for the extra work that's going to go into it. If you use a high-end tax software, they have made provisions within that tax software to recast those for you as long as you do all your coding. So it's really not going to be that much of a difference for people who are using high-end tax software. We happen to use UltraTax, and they've actually rewritten their coding to support this. So that's going to be a good thing. What's really interesting is when you have to go back and amend those returns to take two single people, make them into a married filing joint return for federal tax purposes, and you have to have all the details because IRS won't take it without all the details. So that's where the expense comes in. A lot of accountants have said they're just going to go with a flat rate and say, okay, win, lose, or draw, we're just going to do this for a flat rate, and the pricing varies from, I've seen it from $100 to $500 per couple. It's just across the board because it's an open market, okay? So you just have to find out what your comfort zone is. You can do it on your own. You can file your own amended returns. I say if you're going to do that, make sure you know what you're doing, okay? Because you don't want to try that at home alone if you don't know what you're doing, because it can create further problems with IRS. So that's the long and short of it is, in the state of Georgia, we're going to still be single for tax purposes, or if you qualify for head of household, you could be head of household in the state of Georgia. Many of us work in multiple states. That's when it gets really ugly, okay? Because now we have California, it's 17 states, so I'm going to use California, that recognizes the married filing joint return. I'm going to file a married filing joint federal in California, but I have to recast it for Georgia, okay? But there are also a bunch of states that don't follow, and they follow what Georgia does. We're not going to recognize it. You're going to be single for tax purposes, so you're going to have to recast just for that particular tax return, and that's when it's going to get really crazy. So from a financial standpoint, it makes sense for the state and federal governments all to agree to let us get married, file a joint return. They'll actually make, in most cases, more money on a married filing joint situation if they looked at the overall tax, because most of us are fortunate enough to be highly educated, making professionals, making good income. So the bulk of that money is going to end up causing more income tax for the government. So it would make sense. That's not the way it works. You know, it's got to go through the court system, and that's where we have to go. But right now, that's where we're going to be, and it's basically, they're following this revenue ruling 2013-17 to follow what they're doing. Unfortunately, Georgia has no, I don't know, maybe they do have a case. I haven't seen anything, but yeah, I didn't think so. I've been kind of watching to see if there are any cases in the state of Georgia that have been filed, and so far, nothing has been filed. I don't know if they're even going to entertain this, look at it. It doesn't look like it to me that we're going to be in a spot in the state of Georgia for this to come to fruition for a number of years. We're probably going to be on the tail end of that unless there are many, many lawsuits, which I'm shocked because there are so many LGBT people here in the state of Georgia, and particularly in Atlanta, that nobody's filed a case here. I'm shocked. So it might behoove us to all go out there and file suits so that we can get this through in the state of Georgia.
So, first of all, let me just say, welcome to equality, isn't it? It's a great picture, isn't it? I mean, obviously, we have this mess because we're in fits and starts of equality. We're halfway there. I mean, I have to say, so I am a recent transplant from California, and I remember when we passed our first broad domestic partnership law, and this problem hit California a number of years ago, and people called us, and they were just furious about it because it was hard to understand how moving towards equality could, in that middle purgatory period, make life so difficult. And it is understandably and truly a bit frustrating, although I would say these are the better problems to have than being on the total inequality side of things. There is a question that comes up periodically about why are there lawsuits some places and not others. As you've heard, there are so many of them. But one of the things that we have been looking at as an organization is that there are certain places where there are federal courts of appeal that have put up roadblocks that don't exist in other places. And here in the 11th Circuit, which is where Georgia and Florida and Alabama are, there's a decision on the books from 2004, and it's called Lofton. It was a case that arose from a challenge to Florida's adoption ban at the time, and it went up to this federal court of appeals, and that same set of parenting rationales that I talked about that the Hawaii court adopted just in 2012 in that marriage case was adopted by the Court of Appeals that sort of sits over Georgia. And so that is a roadblock. Those rationales, that decision is a bit older now. Those rationales were never right to begin with. The court didn't look carefully at and perhaps have enough of the evidence in front of it. There may be lots of different reasons to try to understand why the court did what it did. The result is flat wrong, but it is the law. And so it is a pretty daunting obstacle in terms of a suit here, particularly given that whenever we file these marriage equality cases, the first thing that the other side, screams about is parents, parents, children, children. And so when I mention, that we think it is important to be strategic and to be looking at how do we get the greatest number of wins so that if there is a case that the Supreme Court takes, that they have a feeling that, the road is pointing, all signs, all directions are pointing in one way. The quickest, best way to get there is to try to have as many courts rule the right way that we possibly can. And that's, I think, maybe one explanation for why there hasn't been litigation here. There's this big obstacle in our way. It's frustrating, but we're trying to be as savvy as we can, given that it's the reality.
And going back to the issue of the children, if this has been an issue that's come up the last couple of years, in our practice anyway, we would not manipulate, but we would use the tax law to our best advantage for same-sex couples. So if you had children, who would claim the child? If they're not going to recognize the relationship, they can't say you're a family if two people live in the same home and they share children, because they can't have their cake and eat it too. So that's how it's kind of been. Up until last year, the federal government, year before last, the federal government said if you had children and you supported your own household, then both people could be head of household. Okay? So then they said, wait a minute, we have all these same-sex people living together now, having children. Oh my, what do we do? So now they've gone to whoever has the highest income in the household is now, and you share children, is now the person who can claim head of household. So you claim head of household for one who's got the highest income. The other partner cannot be head of household, they have to file single, which hurts you financially, and you lose some other credits and benefits. So that changed a couple of years ago. So that's one of the ways they've kind of manipulated it. If you live in the same household, you want to prove that you are not in a relationship according to the IRS, you both have to pay 50% of your expenses, contribute that to the bank account, split the expenses 50-50, and it's got to be across the board like that. So let's say you've got two children, then you're paying 50-50. One would take one child, one would take the other. You would both be head of household because you're not recognizing your relationship, okay? Does that make sense? That's a way around, it. It doesn't feel good, but it's a way around the tax law, all right? But if you have one joint account and you're putting all your money into one joint account, whoever has the highest income is the qualifier for the head of household if you're not married. So that's another issue that's coming up.
Okay, so I want to thank both Tara and Lynn, and like I said, we'll have and so Tara's already kind of talked a little bit about why not a lawsuit here in Georgia. Georgia Equality is not a legal organization. We don't have the capacity or the ability to file lawsuits. So we really do follow the lead of organizations like Lambda Legal. But we are a political organization and an advocacy organization, and that's what I want to talk about next, is kind of how do we get to where we need to be, and what are the steps that we're starting already to do here in Georgia with that. There we go. So the first thing we need to do is we really have to have an infrastructure for marriage, and I'm actually going to stand up if that's okay with folks. The issues of marriage are very, very complicated, and it's not just the issues of marriage, it's the issues of building a political movement and a campaign towards a specific goal. So we already have a fuller presentation on this. Some of you have seen that. Happy to do it at a later date. I've already done it a couple of times. But we have things in place. So working on safe schools. That is work that is taking us on the grassroots and around the state of Georgia. 47 districts and counting, where we have gotten them to adopt policies that specifically include sexual orientation and gender identity. Right now, we are just shy of 60% of public school students living in one of the districts that has these policies. Our goal is to have that up at 70% by the end of this year. The Fair Employment Practices Act, which is legislation that we have sitting before the legislature right now, it represents the first time that we have actually had bipartisan support for any bill of any type that's a positive bill that specifically includes the words sexual orientation and gender identity. This becomes important because it begins to start conversations within the legislature about the LGBT community. It gives us a platform for educating on our lives, the realities of our lives, the challenges that we face. It also, frankly, from a purely political point of view, gives Republicans the opportunity to experience that they can support and vote for a bill and not lose their seats. Because that's what matters to them. Moderate Democrats and Republicans being able to support our issues publicly and not have negative political ramifications for that. We, of course, have to have enough fair legislators to support legislation when it goes through, and then we have to have what I'm calling a progressive infrastructure. If we actually do end up having to battle this at the ballot box here in Georgia, it's going to take more than a couple of hundred people that are participating tonight. Those of us that fought this fight in 2004 know what it's like to fight it with $100,000 and a couple hundred volunteers. We will lose, and we will lose badly. So it's also building infrastructure over time. So, this is the bad news. I think we all know this. Back in 2004, like I said, we lose and we lose badly. We lost 76% of the public voted against us. And we thought we were waging a great campaign, and we still lost very substantially. We are about to do another flash poll, which is just asking one simple question: do you support the right of same-sex couples to marry here in Georgia? When we asked that question a year ago, or in 2012, what we got was only 27% of the public supported it. So it was not a whole lot better than where we had been in 76% in 2004. 13% were undecided, but our glimmer of hope was that voters under the age of 39, we were at 39% support. So the younger the voters are, the more supportive they are of this issue. That becomes incredibly important to remember in a moment. Earlier this spring, a poll that was conducted in May, and the results that were released, it actually ended up being released the same week as the Supreme Court decision, by a group called the Georgia Social Issues Poll, showed that there was 61% of the public that was opposed to same-sex marriage here in Georgia. 29% support, so a little bit better than what we had found the year before, 10% undecided. So still not great numbers that we were looking at. But in that other poll, that poll that I just told you about, when we start looking, I'm sorry, before I get to that, there is strong support for non-discrimination. This is one of the major reasons why we've chosen to push an employment non-discrimination bill here in Georgia. is that our polling has shown that we are at 79% public support for this. It's really very, very high public support. It gives us a lot of ammunition to begin to have conversations, especially with conservative Democrats and Republicans and rural members of the legislature that are not used to talking about these issues. We can show that Republican support for non-discrimination policies has increased from 68% to 77% in a 2-year period of time, and then again this magic number of younger people, younger voters, 90% support for non-discrimination. So it gives us a great platform to begin to build on. Then when we start looking at some of what you call the crosstabs of the other poll, the poll about marriage, that didn't have the great support that we had hoped, we start seeing what we call the rising American electorate. The reason this is important, and you've heard some about this so far, you'll hear a lot about it from a lot of politicians over the next year. The rising American electorate is identified as single women, people of color, and voters under the age of 29. Currently in Georgia, 61% of eligible voters fall into this category that we call the rising American electorate. It is a substantial majority of eligible voters in Georgia. It's 53% of registered voters, so it's even a slight majority of the registered voters. We are working with some of our colleagues to do some polling, and right now, through different polling that we've done, testing specifically within women, people of color, and voters under the age of 29, across the board we're finding about 60% support for a variety of LGBT issues. So again, we're on the cusp of having a large section of the electorate with us on LGBT issues in general. So when we specifically look at the crosstabs of that social issues poll that came out in June, we saw that 55% of independents actually supported the right of folks to marry. 55% of independents who lean Democratic. So these are folks who don't necessarily identify as Democrats, but are probably on the more liberal end of the moderate spectrum. So it's, again, gives us some good reason for hope. And we had 48% support amongst Democrats. So we're not there completely with Democrats, but we had really strong support. Specifically in the rising American electorate, 30% support for marriage, 35% support, 30% support for marriage amongst women, 35% support amongst Black African American voters, and 56% support under the age of 29. If you add the unsures on top of that, we start getting numbers in the 40s, the low to mid 40s. So again, we're getting close, but we're not quite where we need to be to start pushing this and asking people to publicly vote on it. But we are starting to get close. Then there's some even more good news. And so this came out, the AJC did a poll that showed 48% of Georgia voters supported the right of same-sex couples to marry. 30% of them strong support. 43% opposed, and 38% of those with strong opposition. Now, they did share verbally some of the crosstabs with this, but they wouldn't share all of their polling data with me. So this poll is so different than the results that we had gotten from other polls that had been taken, especially those polls that had been taken just a few months earlier. But we still showed 64% support amongst voters between the ages of 18 and 39. And 39 is great. A lot of polls before that had really shown that the breakoff was at 29 and below, 18 to 29. So we actually are expanding that 18 to 39. We've got really strong, solid support. This is actually what we're shooting for in public polls across the board, that we have 60% support or more. That's what we've seen in other states that have been successful. They've got to get those numbers up to about the 60% mark. Voters over the age of 65%, those are the ones that are most opposed, 59% opposed. This is kind of surprising that individuals with incomes over $100,000 also seem to be very, very supportive of this. at 59%. I can speculate and guess as to why that is, but I don't necessarily want to play this game by speculation and guessing. So I really want to find out why higher income voters here in Georgia seem to be so much more supportive than others. And then the HAC asked the question, have you changed your opinion over the past few years? And 16 to 25% had said yes. Now, we don't know what that means. We don't know if they changed their mind yesterday, 6 months ago, or 2 years ago. So again, it shows us that we're headed in the right direction, that people's opinions on this are changeable and are actively changing. And we are making, of course, assumptions. That if you look at that 16%, the 48%, you subtract 16 from 48, you get, what is that, 32, which is about what those poll numbers from June and May had shown. So we may have actually changed 16% of the population over the summer. We don't know that for sure yet. We've not been able to verify that. So that's kind of where the public is. What is the path? This is just the simple math. There are 120, we need 120 votes in the House out of 180 legislators in the House. We need 36 votes in the Senate out of 56 senators in the state Senate. So that 186 legislators that we need to support us represents roughly every single Democrat that is currently sitting in office and half of the Republicans that are currently sitting in office. Have to be willing to support this and vote on this to have repeal efforts go in front of the voters. Then, of course, we have to launch a public campaign where we have to get 50% of the voters plus one to be able to agree to repeal the constitutional amendment that passed with 76% support just a decade ago. So we do have some big challenges ahead of us. That's why Lynn actually said that she thinks that Georgia will be following up at the tail of it. I actually am going to be a bit more optimistic. I think that we can and will change this, and I think that we're looking more at a horizon of about 3 to 5 years. If we do our work, because of those numbers of the rising American electorate, and because we've got the polling information that is headed our way. So if we actually get out to a ballot fight, this is then our next challenge. So the first challenge is convincing the public to support it so that we can then convince this huge number of legislators to support it, and then we have to fight it. This is what a marriage fight would look like. You can see Maryland, Maine, Minnesota, Washington, those were the ones that were all successful in 2012. They all spent a heck of a lot of money. Georgia is a larger state than any one of these, so we would probably be on that upper end, probably around $10 million. Of all of the philanthropy that goes to LGBT causes around the country, less than 3% of it comes here to the South, which is a structural issue that we're also working on the side, because it's shameful that an entire philanthropic community has just discounted an entire region of the country. No wonder we can't do better if we don't have the sort of resources that the rest of the country has access to, but that's a different conversation for a different day. Our current budget just at Georgia Equality is at $300,000, roughly. So that's just to put it into perspective. That, yeah, we've got a pretty good budget here at Georgia Equality, the biggest budget we've ever had. But $300,000 does not even come close to the $10 million that we would have to raise to do this successfully. And at this point in time, there is no one nationally that we could turn to if we had to fight this battle. We would have to raise that money ourselves. We have never even come close to raising those sorts of dollars for LGBT issues here in Georgia. So that's another challenge that lies in front of us. So our immediate goals, electing a fair majority, and that is not a partisan statement. Because Republicans can be just as fair as Democrats on LGBT issues if they choose to be. And the conversations we have with them, we know that a lot of them are much more fair and much more supportive. That's why we've been able to get our bill as far as it is. I already said we want to cover 70% of public school students by 2014 so that we can show that the vast majority of the state of Georgia is already living with positive LGBT policies in their schools, and the earth did not open up and swallow Covington. Augusta is still there, Macon's on the map, and maybe hell froze over this week, but I think that the sun is coming back out. The world did not end. We have got to do some in-depth polling on these marriage equality messages. I want so much to verify the AJC's numbers. You cannot imagine how much I want those numbers to be real. But first of all, we need to verify that they're really true by duplicating them. And then we've got to figure out if there was a 16-point shift in a 2-month period of time, what were those 1 or 2 messages that caused that shift to happen? Because it would clearly be 1 or 2 very specific messages that resonated within people to get them to change, so many people to change their opinions so dramatically in such a short period of time. And then this last one, we have to prove to the national philanthropic community that Georgia is worth supporting. We are worth having these national organizations put Georgia on the map and develop some resources here. So the last thing is just kind of the progressive infrastructure. And this is these are the groups that we are working with a new organization that we call Pro-Georgia. And you can see we've got Atlanta 9 to 5. They work with working women, primarily lower income women of color. Georgia 1, again, works with women's organizations, League of Women Voters, Planned Parenthood, Partnership for Southern Equity, works with young black men, the NAACP, Georgia Stand Up, the Coalition for the People's Agenda, strong, solid civil rights organizations, the Georgia Association of Latino elected officials, and the Asian American Legal Advocacy Center. So these are the groups and allies that we are already working with to build this progressive infrastructure that can help change Georgia, including helping us be on those front lines to win that ballot initiative if and when we have to fight it. So this next year, all of us at Pro-Georgia, we have some voter engagement goals. So this first one is voters under the age of 30. I think hopefully everybody understands why these voters are so important. These are the voters that are rock solid supporters of the freedom to marry. They tend to vote. About 50% of registered voters under the age of 50 will come out in a presidential election year. Unfortunately, only about 18% will come in an off-election year. So we want to try to get that as close to 50% as possible. We've got to figure out how to activate and energize and mobilize those younger voters to care about issues beyond just who's the president of the country. We are doing strategic work in 23 counties to try to get this done, and that represents 47% of the eligible voters of the state of Georgia. So again, we are really working on pushing that need a little bit further. And it's working with those other organizations, so it's not just youth, it's communities of color, and it's women that are also used to seeing our name, used to looking at our issues, looking to us to help them learn how to vote. We announced this a couple months ago that Lambda Legal, I will acknowledge, is a national organization. I will think of you as local because you're always right here and always such a part of it. So I want to give props out to Lambda Legal first and foremost. But beyond Lambda Legal, the first national organization that's really kind of big and wants to come and do work with us here in Georgia and here in the South is Freedom to Marry. Evan Wolfson's group, one of the groups that actually started this entire process. And we have created the Why Marriage Matters in Georgia campaign. By joining forces with Freedom to Marry, we get access to their talking points, their research, their marketing templates, so that we don't have any cost to begin to develop these materials that we need to begin to shift public opinion. They also have 2 initiatives. One is Young Conservatives for the Freedom to Marry, which is great because the South is probably always going to be pegged, or at least for the foreseeable future, as a conservative place. And they are really dedicated towards energizing and mobilizing conservatives. Because if you really think about it, of the whole host of LGBT issues that we could be working on, marriage is probably the most traditional and conservative of the ones that are out there. And so it does make sense that conservatives should be supportive of this. The other initiative that we were hoping to announce in December, that we were hoping to announce in January, now I'm hoping that we can fully announce it in February, is a specific campaign to Southerners for the Freedom to Marry. And we will be launching that with Freedom to Marry in the next month or two. We also hope to develop a website here in Georgia that is a specific portal that will have the sorts of resources and educational materials that Lynn walked through today, as well as a way for folks to share their testimonials, their stories. It can be a central bank of information on how to find for marriage and answer people's questions who want to go out and get married or want to learn how to support people that they love who are in the process of getting married. We want that to be a separate website from Georgia Equality, so that frankly, if and when we get to the point of being able to launch a statewide repeal effort, it really can be a coalition effort that can immediately move in to this website. We started a Facebook group that in the last 3 months has grown to over 7,900 people. Facebook is not the ideal way to mobilize folks, but at least it's a way for folks to begin to share information. And frankly, what we're starting to see in a lot of it is that a lot of folks come on there and post hateful, negative comments. And we're right now allowing it to be a free, open forum so that people can post those things, and we very seldom go in and edit or ban people from that page. And so folks are actually learning through Facebook on how to engage opponents in conversations about the freedom to marry. We spend a lot of time checking into with the folks, the LGBT and the supportive folks that are on these pages, to make sure that they feel that they're supported and make sure that they feel that they're not being beat up. And the feedback that we're getting so far has been really, really good. And then that messaging research. We're beginning to do that already to the best of our ability. We'll talk about that in just a little bit more about why that messaging research is so important and how you can help with that. Building the C4 infrastructure over a 3-year period of time. So again, we're kind of looking at trying to have everything in place that we could fight this fight by 2018. The reason I look at a 3-year period of time is by talking to organizations that have been successful with these fights around the state. It has taken each and every one of them no less than 3 years to build their infrastructure to be successful. So it just does take a period of time. A lot of them have been building these fights for close to 5 years, but we're really gonna try to make sure that we're solid and able to go in 3 years. We need to grow and sustain our phone banking and door-to-door efforts. Again, looking back at 2004, across the state, it was a dismal failure. But we actually had people that were going and having conversations one-on-one, knocking on doors, primarily knocking on doors, and some phone work. I myself worked with a group of people that every Tuesday night we were up in Druid Hills. We hit about 4,000 to 5,000 households, 4,000 to 5,000 conversations. The precincts that we worked at, we won with slight majorities. They were able to do the same thing in Athens, Georgia, and the precincts that they were able to work with, they too won with slight majorities. We're able to do a little bit in Savannah, and they didn't quite do as well, but they also had very strong numbers. So it does work by having these one-on-one conversations. But you need to mobilize tens of thousands of people to have hundreds of thousands and millions of conversations to be able to win this here in Georgia. So we started last fall getting people into our office twice a month to do phone banking. We call them outreach nights, because if we said we were calling them phone banking nights, no one would show up. So instead we call them outreach nights, and people are coming and they're finding out that they can actually have conversations with strangers over the phone. And we hope to be able to build and grow those efforts, create teams, and expand that so that it's not just happening here twice a month, it is actually happening statewide. And do you know the benefit of that? Is that in the process we're going to build support for all of these other issues that we care about, because those are the things that we're doing phone banking on right now, as we build towards marriage. We need to establish more reasonable benchmarks for public support, since we don't actually know what our baseline is. We know that it's probably higher than the 32%. I'm still a little skeptical that it's as high as the 48%. So we've got to figure that out. Once we've got those benchmarks, then we can start tracking our progress and figuring out where we need to be, how quickly we feel that we can get there to get to the numbers that we feel are going to be critical so that we can actually start introducing the legislation and really working to push for repeal. The next thing we need to do is we need to establish strong rural and religious outreach efforts. Because the truth of the matter is, while we may live here in the metro Atlanta area, and we may live in a community where we've got strong support from our friends and families and coworkers, that is not the case for everybody around the state. And we cannot win this with Atlanta alone. It has to be a statewide effort. So we've got to get out there and figure out how to reach rural communities. And we have to figure out how to solidify and strengthen our religious outreach efforts as well. Along the way, one of the benchmarks that we're working on are domestic partnership registries. And I know that a lot of folks are saying, why are you spending your time on domestic partnership registries? Because that's not where we want to go. No, it's not where we want to go. We're not doing this just for the sake of DP registries. We're doing it for two reasons. One, it is a way to have these conversations with sitting elected officials and get them to go on record, not with a promise, because promises are easy, but with a vote, because votes are harder. It is a surrogate for marriage. And anyone, I'm sure that probably not a lot of folks read it, but the Clarkston City Council, back in late November, early December, when they voted on their resolution very specifically said, the state of Georgia will not allow us to marry gay and lesbian couples in our own community, but the state of Georgia will allow us to set up a domestic partner registry. So falling short of being able to enact marriage in Clarkston, it is a social justice issue that we stand behind, to be able to have some sort of at least recognition that the couples exist. We want to create some more outreach materials on that, because frankly, if we had more people filling out these domestic partnership registries, again, it just adds proof that it's real families, real couples, real lives that are currently being harmed by our amendment here in Georgia. And then if all of that works, I'm hoping that by 2016, we can actually put a question out on the Democratic primary ballot about marriage repeal efforts, which would give us an opportunity to test our strength with a statewide initiative, because we would have to win that statewide vote. The reason why we want to start with a primary ballot question is that if we happen to lose, we don't necessarily backtrack. But if we win, and I do believe that we would win that, it shows growing momentum, and it actually gets a large and growing number of voters voting to repeal the marriage amendment here in Georgia.